Y'all remember how I finished Persona 5 and I was looking around for RPGs that were kinda sorta like it? And I almost ended up playing this game first? Yeah, good times. Trails of Cold Steel, or Said no Kiseki, came out in 2013 for PS3 and PS Vita. Other regions of Asia received it the following year. It came to North America in 2015 and Europe in 2016 for those same two platforms. In 2017, a PC version was released worldwide, and a year later it finally came to PS4, which, looking back, they probably should have done that way earlier, but better late than never. That PS4 version of the game came over to the West a year later in 2019, and it's also worth noting that there is a Switch version of the game that came out in 2021, but only for Asia. The game takes place not after Trails to Azure, but during it, so yeah, that's the thing with the Cold Steel games. If you're playing the series in release order, you're going to end up going back in time a bit. Cold Steel 1 begins around late Zero and continues all the way to the end of Azure's Fragment chapter, so it runs concurrently with the previous Crossbell arc as opposed to right after it. If Cold Steel is your first Trails game, just disregard what I said, it'll make sense when you go back and play the older ones. And I guess now is a very good time to address an all too familiar question. Do you need to play the first 5 games to understand this one? No. Well, obviously I'm gonna have a little more to say than just that, but the simple answer is no, you don't have to. Will you get far more enjoyment if you play it with prior knowledge of the other 2 arcs? Absolutely, that's how it was meant to be played. And I really think when this topic comes up and I see other people's opinions on it, I think a lot of people really downplay just how many callbacks there are to the older games. But the difference is, these are a lot more subtle than usual. Even with my Zero video, which was also the start of a new arc in the series, I said it could have been an okay entry point had it not been for the game also carrying over a certain character's story arc and assuming you were already up to speed with it. But Cold Steel 1 has no such thing. I had brought up a similar phenomenon back in my Kingdom Hearts 3 review years ago. Any of you who remember that are real OGs, but I'll say it again here because I totally think it fits this situation too. Things related to the older games do get brought up, and pretty often at that, but these events happen around the main cast and not directly to them. It's usually relayed to the player through in-universe radio broadcasts, newspapers, in-game books, or private conversations between NPCs. Every conflict or issue that happens to these characters, at least for now, in the scope of this game, was pretty self-contained and, as I said, only directly affected them. As far as being newcomer friendly, this actually works massively in the game's favor, since it alludes to just enough that release order players will pick up on things and point it out, but not so much so that a new player would be getting spoiled left and right and their head would be spinning from all the information. Cold Steel 1 is the most self-contained entry in the series since Sky FC, which was the first game. I don't think there's any Trails fan who could look you in the eye and tell you with a straight face that Sky FC isn't the best entry point if you want the best narrative experience, but if you really didn't want to start with Sky FC for whatever reason, I do believe Cold Steel 1 would be your second best entry point. Now that does come with another issue though. Cold Steel 1 has some insane quality of life features, which I'll get into in a little bit, and I do think experiencing this game first could make it harder to go back to the older ones gameplay wise. That being said, to conclude this tangent, I guess, it's not a bad game to be your first. It's not as ideal as Sky FC, but it's still better to start here than to start at Zero. Oh, right, I was talking about the setting before I got sidetracked. So as I said, it runs concurrently with the 2 Crossbell games, and it takes place in the Erebonian Empire. Yes, the big-ass juggernaut of a country that you kept hearing about in Sky and Crossbell. You finally get to set foot in it. You play as Class 7, a small group of students given a unique curriculum at the behest of the prince. Well, one of the princes. It quickly snowballs into something far bigger, and what started as basic combat training and a monthly tour of the country ends up leading to high-stakes missions that could very well change the shape of the entire empire. Whew. What am I doing? This is a review, not a trailer. Next up is the battle system, and fair warning, we might be here a while, because out of all the games I've played in the series so far, Cold Steel 1 probably has the most changes from its predecessor. I am going to take it from the top since Cold Steel is the start of a new arc and this could very well be your first Trails game, so let's get into it. So, as usual, battles are turn-based and you can have up to 4 characters on screen at a time. Each character has 3 resources, their HP, EP, and CP. HP is your health, pretty self-explanatory. Don't let that go to 0 or the character will die, or get KO'd, whatever. EP is the Trails equivalent of MP, and it's your mana resource for spellcasting. Spells in the game are called arts, and as I realized in this game, that's kind of because there's a difference between orbal arts and actual magic. But during gameplay, arts do function the same way magic would in other JRPGs. Bear in mind, it takes 2 minutes to cast... 2 minutes. 2 minutes. You know what? I'm leaving that in. Bear in mind, it takes 2 turns to cast an art. 1 turn to select the spell, and then the spell is cast on the character's next turn, provided nothing interrupts them. Take note that stronger spells have a longer cast delay than weaker ones. CP stands for craft points. These are special attacks unique to each character. They can perform more niche things such as AoE damage, an alternative to healing, stat boosting, or inflicting debuffs and status ailments. Unlike EP, your craft points are a bit more of a precious resource since they get yeeted into Gehenna if your character dies. Each character also has a super move called an S-Craft. It consumes all of your remaining CP, provided you had at least 100, and it does big damage. And I do mean big damage. Crafts seem significantly stronger in this game. You can also do something called S-Breaking, where you can command a character to S-Craft immediately on the next turn, even if it wouldn't have naturally been their next turn. This is useful if you want to interrupt an enemy's string of turns, or if you need a character's turn to fall on one of the turn order bonuses. Speaking of which, the list of icons at the left side of the screen displays the turn order for the battle. Characters that have a higher speed stat will get more turns, and you can use time arts or delaying attacks to manipulate when and how often characters and enemies get to move. There are also bonuses along the timeline. They do things like replenish resources, critical attacks, and bonus Sepith. There were also some new bonuses and inconveniences added in this game. Zero Arts, which allows you to cast a free art with no EP cost, and it takes only 1 turn instead of 2. Status Attack, which will inflict a random status ailment on the enemy if you hit them. And, the bane of my existence, CP Loss, which will take all of your CP if your turn lands on it. Seriously, fuck this thing! Now for the new mechanics. First of all, whenever you get a triple advantage, which is the same as Crossbell's party max advantage by the way, you gain a little bit of CP and the game will shave off a bit of HP from each enemy to get you a head start. Support skills don't happen anymore on the timeline, but instead your support members can be switched out mid-battle now. There are also some parts of the game where you'll be permitted to carry 3 support characters instead of the usual 2. Similar to how every enemy in the series is weak or resistant to certain elemental arts, Cold Steel implemented something similar for the weapons called Unbalancing. Every equipable weapon in the game falls into one or more of 4 categories: Slash, Pierce, Thrust, and Crush. Each weapon has a letter rating of S, A, B, C, or D in each category to indicate how good it is at unbalancing an enemy weak to that weapon type. So the weaker an enemy is to a certain weapon type, the higher of a chance you have to unbalance the enemy if they're hit by a character who carries that corresponding weapon. Do note that landing a critical hit with anything besides an art or an S-Craft will be an automatic unbalance regardless of the type of weapon that was used. Unbalancing goes hand in hand with another new system called linking. So because there's 4 characters on the front lines, you can have up to 2 links, 1 link for every pair of characters. But basically when you unbalance an enemy, a cut-in will appear, and if you have another character linked to them, they can do a follow-up attack without consuming their turn. Every time you link attack, you get a brave point, and the brave stuff kinda works the same way they did in Sky, where 3 brave points will allow 2 currently linked characters to rush the enemy, and then 5 brave points and link attacking will cause all 4 characters to gang up on the enemy. The quartz that you can collect as the game progresses are also a bit different from the other 2 arcs. They no longer have Sepith values, and placing quartz with different values on the same line won't be what determines your arts. Instead, most quartz either provide 1 art and nothing more, or they provide a boost to a certain stat and nothing more. Only quartz of higher rarities will give you both, typically boosting your stats and then giving you 1 or more arts. So your ideal quartz towards the end of the game will give you a significant boost to a certain stats, or multiple stats, along with 2 or 3 really good arts. At the center of each character's Orbment, which are called Arcuses in this game because they're a different model, but each device has a larger slot in the middle which holds a Master Quartz. Master Quartz usually specialize in a certain stat, and equipping it to a character will significantly boost that stat for that character. Master Quartz level up the more a character uses it, and as it levels up, the stats increase and it even gains its own built-in arts. Take note that Master Quartz will retain their level even if you give it to another character, so feel free to switch them around and replace them with newer ones you find later in the story if you feel you need to. Another thing that they changed in this game, Master Quartz no longer come with Master Arts at level 5. Actually, when I asked, you guys told me Azure was the only game in the series that bothered doing Master Arts, and they never went that route again. Still, it's not that bad, as the bonuses you do obtain from Master Quartz are a lot more potent in my opinion, and you can straight up break certain characters with certain Master Quartz combinations. Without spoiling the game, though I'm gonna do that in the next section anyway, but the story was alright. It's definitely a lot slower paced than Azure, but of course it's the start of a new arc, so that's to be expected. I would say personally, it's my favorite prologue game so far. It's not perfect, but I loved how everything was structured for most of the game. It allowed it to fall into a pleasant rhythm even during slower parts, which is actually very reminiscent of real life school. And I'd say out of all the games so far, this game's set of minor NPCs, so just the bystanders that you can talk to while you're walking around, are probably my personal favorite so far. Thor's definitely has an interesting bunch of students, but I loved them, and I found most of them to be pretty entertaining. Personal favorite is probably Little Miss Fortune-Telling Shut-In over here. And with that being said, I'm about to talk spoilers, so this is your warning. Keep in mind that I'm going to be talking about the events in the game as if you're all caught up. So if you've only played Cold Steel 1 and you're watching this and plan to go back to the older games to fill yourself in, I'm giving you guys a warning as well. If you're still sticking around, I'm assuming you've either played the games already or you don't care, so let's get into it. Reen is the new main protagonist of this arc. In Sky, you were a hero for hire, in Crossbell you were a police officer, and now, 5 games later, you're a military student. Interestingly enough, he also briefly went to the 8 Leaves school, which makes the Cold Steel arc the first in the series to feature an 8 Leaves practitioner as its main protagonist. I don't have terribly much I can say about Reen's personality outside of being your typical goody two-shoes, a lot like Lloyd was in the last arc. I will say, they do seem to be going in a direction with Reen's story that's somewhat different from Estelle and Lloyd. And that's the idea of being given immense power from the get-go, and your challenge is more so reining it in so you don't hurt your loved ones, as opposed to starting from the bottom and progressively gaining strength, which has kind of become the norm for Trail's protagonists. Not that Reen doesn't go through this as well, but there's definitely that sort of other side to his character arc that just wasn't too present with Estelle and Lloyd. Kevin kinda falls into that category, but then again, he was only the main protagonist for one game. For the longest time, Reen kept a secret from his friends, heavily implied that something traumatic happened when he was young, and he's been wrestling with it ever since. You see, when someone touches his sister in the wrong places, he gets a bit protective. Elisa is technically the second Class 7 member you're introduced to. The bitch is tsundere incarnate. I'm only being half serious. When you consider she has a dead father, a workaholic mother, a pervert grandpa, and an Ouroboros enforcer for a nanny, I'd say she could have definitely turned out worse. Also, similar to Ellie in Crossbell, she's probably going to be the quote-unquote canon ship for the Cold Steel arc, since her bonding events seem way more intimate and personal than the other girls that are available. She's not my favorite, but she's pretty cool. The other significant piece of her story has to do with her family. If you played the previous games, you already know about the Reinford Company. Elisa's mom is the current chairman, and they develop weapons, military vehicles, artillery, orbments, and other stuff mostly related to combat. The Reinford Company were the ones responsible for building the 2 railway guns at Guerrilla Fortress, and this was actually the final nail in the coffin that caused Elisa's family dynamic to sort of spiral out of whack. Her grandpa, Gwyn Reinford, stepped down as chairman because he didn't want to do the project, but the mother, Irina, did, and she went behind his back to get it approved. Gwyn stepped down and ran away out of shame, leaving Irina in charge, and their personal maid, Sharon, whom Elisa saw as family too, had to back Irina's decision because that was her job. And you will notice this pattern with a lot of the other main characters too. So far, pretty much everyone except one person in Class 7 has some kind of fucked up family dynamic. Elliot, Music Man himself. I don't have much to say on him, unfortunately, and it's nothing against him personally, he just doesn't really take up as much narrative space as some of the other characters. He's probably the most normal guy in the class, actually. The biggest thing they probably divulge about him in this game is his relationship with his father. So his father is a military general for the Imperial Army. Elliot really wanted to go to music academy because he really likes music. All of his crafts are music-based, and he even turns his orbital staff into a violin when he uses his S-craft. Elliot's dad told him no, so he let his sister go, but because he viewed music as more of a feminine thing, he didn't think it was fitting for men to make a career out of that. A lot of what Elliot goes through is resentment towards his dad for crushing his dreams and being so stereotypical while doing it. That being said, I don't think his father was trying to be malicious. I genuinely think it was misguided concern for the family and making sure Elliot was in position to take care of himself when he got older. Their mom is dead, by the way. And I say this because when you meet Elliot's dad in person, he's like this big fucking teddy bear, like especially around his son. Anyway, Elliot eventually does grow to appreciate going to Thor's, and as he grows closer to the members of Class 7, he even remarks that he's straight up glad that he ended up there instead of Music Academy like he originally planned. One last thing about him, in terms of gameplay, this guy is an insane healer. Holy shit, just slap a seraphic ring quartz on him, spam his crafts whenever applicable, and there are very few situations in which he can't pull the party back from a game over. He's a top contender for best boy just on that alone. Laura is a noble belonging to the Arside family, which is famous for their swordsmanship and their school, which goes by the same name. Much like Elliot, they don't do too much with her personally, she's kind of just there a lot of the time. However, much like Elisa, it's her parent, in this case her father, that holds all the fame. The relationship between Laura and her dad is like Estelle and Cassius 2.0. Her father is not a divine blade, however, though I'm sure in terms of strength and skill, he's probably on similar footing. Wait a minute, this is about Laura. Why am I spending so much time talking about her dad? Gameplay-wise, Laura is absolutely broken, filling the same heavy-hitting bruiser role that Agate and Randy did in the previous 2 arcs. She is literally the complete package. She has suction, AoEs, self-buffing, she can cut defense. She is a one-woman army. Someone call for backup. Holy shit. Gaius is a very interesting member of the class, as he's the only character that technically doesn't come from Erebonia. He comes from the Nord Highlands, which is still technically part of the Empire, but at the same time it isn't, and other people in the school still call him foreigner sometimes, and it's complicated. But he's the closest thing the class has to an exchange student. He's also the only student in the class that has a happy family with no extra drama in the background, so go figure. Residents of the Nord Highlands also have different religious beliefs, which is a bit refreshing since the vast majority of the characters in the franchise align with the Septon Church to varying degrees. It's not often they introduce characters that have different beliefs. I think the only other time was the DG cult and its surviving members, and yeah. You know how that went. While those in the Highlands still believe in Adios and still subscribe to the church, they also put an equal amount of stock in the Winds. They commend it for bringing them good things, helping them with decision making. They sort of, I guess they kind of treat it like the Force in Star Wars, if I had to pick one thing to compare it to. Also, fair warning, Gaius is to Wind what Lloyd was to Barriers, so yeah, I expect to hear about that a lot as I continue through the Cold Steel arc. Eustace is the group's male tsundere and the pinnacle of Erebonian nobility. I know I haven't really gotten into the relationship between nobles and commoners yet, so now might be a good time to do so. Erebonia has somewhat of a caste system, for lack of a better term. That actually might be a slightly incorrect way to describe it, because there are cases of commoner families working their way into high positions, like the Reinford family. But aside from that, yes, the family you were born into determines your worth, occupation, and the trajectory of your life in general. So, probably not surprisingly, there is a lot of beef between a lot of nobles and commoners. You even see a little bit of this in Crossbow. Whenever Erebonian nobles would come to Crossbow for vacation, they often talked down to the special support section and even thought they were above Crossbow's laws at times. Back to Eustace. He's part of the Albarea family, one of Erebonia's 4 great houses. The other 3 houses being House High Arms, House Rogner, and House Cayenne. While he does definitely have a very apparent ego about him, I feel like a lot of it is probably just insecurity too on his part. His mother, who was a commoner that his father knocked up during an affair, mind you, died, and then his dad doesn't really care about him much at all, and even though his older brother Rufus does care for him, Rufus himself is quite busy, so they don't see each other a lot. So Eustace has a lot he's trying to compensate for, and you can see small acts of kindness on his part throughout the game that he'll quickly try and mask as just one-off or necessities for whatever assignment they're on. But I do think he genuinely does does care about his classmates though, and even his sworn enemy Machias, who I'll get into in a little bit. Eustace being a bastard kid is interesting though, because this means that Reen, Elisa, and Eustace himself form the holy trinity of I can't believe it's not noble. Think about it. All three of them have unique circumstances that technically qualify them for higher status, but also sort of distance them from both groups. Reen is a commoner by blood since his biological parents were. However, since he was adopted by nobles, Reen became a noble legally on paper. Elisa's family are commoners, but the Rhineford group made them so much money that they can afford to live in luxury and are even more powerful than some noble families. And finally, Eustace is technically half noble, but it's his father's side that's taking care of him. However, since his mom is a commoner, that stigma still lingers and sort of wears down on him mentally. The figurative stigma, not the actual stigmas in the series. That's something completely different. Machias is the polar opposite of Eustace. Eustace being a grumpy noble that kinda sorta looked down on everyone. Machias is the commoner equivalent, very critical of those around him, and he absolutely cannot stand nobles. His words. Eustace actually picks up on this very early into the game and eggs him on for the first few chapters, which creates some very strong friction between the two that does end up jeopardizing the team in some situations. And even after the two of them make up, somewhat, they still kind of just tolerate each other. Or maybe they're just fucking around at this point, who knows. Machias' father is the current governor of Erebonia and Chancellor Osborne's right-hand man. So somewhat like Elisa, even though he's a commoner, his family still has a significant pull when it comes to Erebonia's political climate, though the Regnitz family lives a lot more modestly than the Rhinefords, in comparison. There's also his family background, because remember, the only person here who has a happy blood-related family is Gaius. Machias lived with his father and cousin. The cousin was so close to the immediate family that Machias saw her as an older sister. Things were going great until his cousin started dating a noble guy, and as you can imagine, they both got lots of shit for it. The noble guy's side of the family in particular harassed Machias' cousin, and the final nail in the coffin was the noble offering for her to become his side piece instead of his wife in an attempt to save face. She, unalived herself shortly afterwards. I can't say it like it is because YouTube is YouTube, but you get the picture. So it's heavily implied that this experience is what really kickstarted his disdain for nobles. And yeah, while it's out of line for Machias to assume that every noble was a terrible person just because of that, I do want to say lived experience is always going to weigh heavier than something you were simply told. From his point of view, fucking around with nobles is what killed his cousin. So regardless of whether or not his beliefs were right, it was something that would be very hard for him to let go of since it directly took something from him. Granted, his opinion on nobles does soften throughout the game. Like I said, he's still not very fond of Eustace, but it might be more of a rivalry at this point instead of genuinely disliking the guy. You ever just bump into someone and just start thinking, perfection? Anyway, Fee is one of the obligatory younger characters in the cast. I think the coolest thing about her though is just how much she doesn't give a shit. She sleeps wherever she wants, yawns during fights, crams tests the night before. Like, I think I found my spirit animal, y'all. She's also a former Jaeger. She used to work with Zephyr, which was mentioned back in Crossbell. If you remember, Zephyr's leader and Red Constellation's leader both fought and then they killed each other. Unlike Red Constellation, however, it seems Zephyr didn't really have a proper successor, so the entire corps ended up disbanding. This was also most likely how Garcia from Crossbell ended up working for Ravak, because if you remember, he was also part of Zephyr as well. It was Sarah, Class 7's instructor, who found Fee one day, and that's how she ended up at Thor's. And what's interesting is she frequently talks about family and how Zephyr filled that void for her right up until they disbanded. However, at the end of the game, or more specifically if you do her bonding, she acknowledges Class 7 as her new family, which kind of puts into perspective how drastically her outlook on her situation changes from the start of the game to the end of it. Guys, I have a conspiracy theory. Emma's plot relevance is stored in her titties, and that's why she didn't do much in this game. Kinda like Risha's Nagong technique, except Emma has way less control over it. Okay, jokes aside, you can tell pretty quickly that Emma knows way more about the bigger picture than she lets on, to the point where I called her a twist villain multiple times during my playthrough because, I mean, guys, come on. Can you really blame me for that one? How many times have I gotten burned by someone wearing glasses? Machias is exempt because he looks like Dudley, but Emma? Look, forgive me, the only red flag she didn't have was blue hair. I need to stop. Okay, there's this mysterious cat named Celine who always just so happens to be watching when something fucked up is going on, and for the longest time Emma was the only one who could understand her. When Reen unlocks his demonic looking powered up form, which I don't even think they've officially named yet, I just call him Mean Reen, courtesy of Sarah, but yeah, that stuff happens to him, and at the very least, it seems like Emma has an idea about what happens to him, which is far more than what everyone else knows, and then the cat seems to know exactly what's going on and just doesn't say nothing. Emma's a witch. Like, unironically so. I'm not just talking about one single line on the Orbment, like she can use certain spells on her own without one. Namely, healing Reen's injury in chapter 2, picking a lock later on in that same chapter, and during one of her bonding scenes, I can't remember exactly at which point in the game, but she shows Reen that she can light candles on her own too, which implies some spontaneous fire manipulation on her part. She also seems to have a lot of dirt on Vita, one of the game's main villains, who's also a powerful sorceress. So yeah, maybe they come from the same background or something, or maybe they were former friends or even relatives. They just seem connected, I have a hunch. Like I implied earlier though, you don't really get to see much of this from Emma. There seems to be a lot of things Emma is connected to that they really just leave you hanging with. Matter of fact, she's the only character in Class 7's core group, excluding the instructors or auxiliary members, whose family you don't get to visit. The Cold Steel arc is extremely long, so I'm sure there's way more to come regarding her, but for now, just looking at this game, she's the least important importance character, if that makes sense. Milliam is the other young lolly character in this game. Kinda like Emma, you don't really learn much about her in this game either, even though it seems there's a lot of layers to her as well. She has what appears to be a robot that she can summon at will. I jokingly call it a stand and will continue to do so, but Milliam herself calls it Eragetlam, or Lammy for short. It mimics her movements, gives her enhanced strength and durability, it can fire lasers, morph into various weapons like a hammer and a ball, generate barriers to nullify damage. It's a very interesting weapon. It also looks like a larger and more completed version of the combat shells that Class 7 was required to fight during their practical exams, but they never really go anywhere with this connection. Maybe they will in a later game, but for this one specifically, they're kinda just there. Milliam also doesn't join Class 7 from the get-go. She works under Osborne for the Imperial Intelligence Division alongside Lecter and Claire, who leads the Railway Military Police. She joins Class 7 a little over the halfway point. Her true purpose for doing that is revealed close to the end of the game. When Class 7 figures out who the main antagonist was, Milliam tells them that she was sent to the Academy undercover because the Intelligence Division suspected that the big bad might have been hiding out at the school and posing as one of the students or staff. And it turns out they were right. They figured it out a little too late, but they were right. Sarah is Class 7's homeroom instructor and probably the most obsessive beer drinker since Scheherazade.
Finally, a worthy opponent. Our battle will be legendary!
She stands out from the other instructors as I believe she's the only one with no formal military training. Don't quote me on that, but as far as I can tell, I think so. She used to be a bracer and then got put out of work when most of the Empire's branches were shut down not too long ago. That's about as much as I can say about her though. She's briefly playable during the attack on Guerrilla Fortress in Chapter 5, but for most of the game she just mentors the rest of the class. And when I say mentor, I mean outsourcing 90% of the errands and team building to Reen, while she drinks herself underneath a table at the nearest bar. What a fucking legend. Next up, we've got Angelica. Lock your waifus up, she is on the prowl and she will claim all of them. The younger, the better. To be honest, I was this close to dropping her in lore of villains just for that alone, but anyway. She is the pervert character of this arc, or at least one of them. You know the type. They say something really suggestive and the entire cast scolds them for like 5 minutes. I do like what they're attempting to do with her character though. It's a bit similar to Elliot in the sense that her family wants one thing for her and she wants something different. She belongs to one of the 4 great houses, House Ragnar to be specific. She's Marquise Ragnar's daughter. She would have to explain that to you though, because you most certainly wouldn't be able to tell she was Erebonian nobility without her saying so herself. Most nobles you see in the game are very prim and proper and whatnot, staying within a very narrow margin of what's socially acceptable amongst them. And then you have this lesbian martial artist lolicon biker of a girl who gives almost less of a shit than Fee does, but can still definitely hold her own in a fight. It's just a really fun time when she's around. I gotta take my hat off to her, honestly. She hangs out with 3 other students, George, Toa, and Crow. Together, the 4 of them were the ones who were required to test drive Class 7's curriculum, as well as their Arcus Orbment, which at the time were still in development. And this is actually the in-universe reason as to why she and Crow can link with the rest of the class before the latter officially joined Class 7, and and that's because they were the original ones who tested the devices. I feel like I should mention Olivier here. Now seems like as good of a time as any. He doesn't have an extremely active role in this game, but it's worth noting that he's the one who came up with the idea for Class 7, a mixed group of noble and commoner students that he would use to spearhead change in the Empire by proving that the two groups are capable of working together. And what's really interesting is that his experience on the Liber arc back in Sky is what inspired him to make this decision. So even that far back in the series, there were things being set into motion that are only just now coming to fruition. That's kind of just how Trails works in general, but it's still really cool to see that type of continuity each time it happens. Matter of fact, I don't think I did mention this before, but yes, the classes excluding 7, which I just mentioned, are segregated. Noble students wear white and make up class 1 and 2. Commoner students wear green and make up classes 3 through 5. There is no class 6, although I like to imagine that maybe Crow, Angelica, Toa, and George were considered class 6 during their testing period. Probably not, but you know, just me being me. Sticking with the canon here, they skipped class 6 and went straight to 7 as far as naming, so yeah, that was weird. Politically speaking, there are two established factions in the game for the nobles and the commoners respectively. The noble faction is the one that values the preservation of tradition and would prefer to keep Erebonia structured the way it is. They're led by Duke Cayenne, another great house leader. The commoner faction, or reformists as they go by too at times, would prefer if some serious changes were to take place. They're led by Chancellor Osborne, and you kind of get to see the two butting heads as you progress through the game. Olivier is trying to establish a third faction that, if I'm not mistaken, is an attempt to sort of reconcile between the other two. He even got his own airship, which is basically just a red Aerocell. Though the Aerocell was nothing to scoff at, so it's not any less of a W, just saying. Oh, also, one last thing. This guy has a sister, apparently, and you only just now get to meet her? And she's pretty damn cute, too. Oh, he has a brother as well. I guess he's cool. Moving on. The Imperial Liberation Front, or ILF for short, as I will call it sometimes during this video, are a group of terrorists who are targeting the Chancellor. Osborne's push for reform hasn't been a flawless one, and as you begin to learn upon meeting these guys, a lot of Osborne's changes, many of which involve annexing certain areas of the Empire and leaving these people homeless, have left some people feeling very bitter and angry. So much so that some have turned to terrorism. Gideon, or G for short, since each of these guys go by their first initial as their code name, is the first ILF member you end up meeting, though unlike many of his peers, he joined the group more for intellectual reasons. Nothing that Osborne has done has affected him personally, he just simply read up on Osborne's policies, being a professor at an academy in Heimdall. Gideon began to protest the changes, believing that it wouldn't do the Empire any good in the long run, and I guess he got a little too radical doing that because he was dismissed from the academy shortly afterward, and I think that's when he finally joined the terrorists. The most interesting thing about G, however, is the fact that if you're playing in release order, then you've already seen him appear in Crossbell. In the Kai and Nisa localization of Azure, he even gets a portrait, and you can tell it's him specifically because you can see little bits of his hair under the helmet, as well as the stubble on the tip of his chin. Anyway, he decides to lead the Liberation Front in the attack on Orcus Tower, but if you remember, the Red Constellation killed all of them except for I think one guy who surely was messing around with when the special support section caught them. So Gideon dies then, off screen, which I think is a bit anticlimactic since he's such a prominent early villain in the game, and unless you played Azure already, his death is told to you instead of shown. Dying off screen is certainly a way to go out, I guess. Scarlet is another main member of the Liberation Front. They don't really divulge much about her though. Actually, she's the only member who you don't find out her clear-cut reason for joining the group, though if I had to guess, it probably had to do with the multiple annexations. That seemed like the most common cause. Vulcan is introduced at basically the same time Scarlet is. Vulcan is a bit different though, since his reasons for joining the ILF were kind of preventable, unlike everyone else. Vulcan belonged to a Jaeger Corps called Armgar. One day they accepted a job to essentially harass the Chancellor shortly after Osborne obtained the title. To put it in his words, they weren't required to necessarily assassinate him, just give him a little scare. Osborne's response to this was swift and brutal. He killed off Vulcan's entire group and left him as the sole survivor. So Vulcan joined the ILF as a means of revenge. Whether or not what Osborne did was overkill is debatable, but I still believe Vulcan's situation is the most self-inflicted, considering slaughtering or getting slaughtered kind of just comes with the job when you're a Jaeger Jaeger. It's sad that all of his comrades died, especially if there were any children that were amongst them, but, you know, still, fuck around and find out. We're finally getting into the two twist villains. First up is Crow, who, for all intents and purposes, is basically the big bad of the game. As I said, Crow was one of the 4 students who tested the new curriculum for Class 7. He's this arc's other main pervert character, though he has more of a gambling ladies man Casanova vibe to him, which makes him a bit more similar to Randy, Olivier, arguably Wazzy as well. But Crow was pretty cool, even if it was all just an act. He genuinely helped Class 7 out in a lot of tight situations. I don't even buy the fact that he hates them, he just values them less than his current mission, and probably just underestimated how much fun he'd have while he was at the academy. But regardless of all that, his time at the academy was just to give him something to do while covering his real occupation, which was the leader of the Imperial Liberation Front, in which he referred to himself as Comrade C and donned the obligatory mask because remember, the start of every arc needs a masked person that you fight later as a hard boss. As I said, the Imperial Liberation Front's job was to kill the Chancellor, and the thing is, they actually succeed. Well, it isn't really that much of a surprise since they already tell you this in Azure that Osborn's gonna get shot, but yeah, the game ends on a very high note for the bad guys, and it sets into motion what would later become the Erebonian civil war between the two factions. It's also quite obvious that Crow is far stronger than he initially lets on, since when he fights as C and has no reason to hold back, the man is actually pretty damn scary. What I mean to say is fuck that Chapter 6 boss fight. You first meet Misty very early into the game. She works at the radio station in Trista, the same town the academy is located in. She ran her own show called Abendtime, and Reed and a few other students would tune in and listen. Pretty harmless so far. Although, I should have known from the start that she was up to no good. I mean, look at her. She's wearing glasses! Glasses! How could I have been so blind? I know Emma's true purpose now. She was supposed to throw you off so you wouldn't suspect Misty. Anyway, Misty has another alias. She's also the famous opera singer Vita Clotilde, whom Elliot and Machias seem to be big fans of. Misty was just a disguise to keep fans off of her back when she wanted to be out and about in public. Although Reed manages to figure out pretty quickly that they're the same person, and I'm almost certain the only reason Emma doesn't instantly figure it out is because the two never interact directly throughout the game. So, okay, she sneaks around for a bit, but it's not really that big of a deal, and the disguise is understandable if she's famous. Then, near the end of the game, she reveals that she's the second Angus beef of Ouroboros, so I guess add her to the list of magical twist villains associated with the Society. Blue Blonde shows up too, though his role this time is extremely minor. On one hand, it's the first time you're seeing him in person since Sky, but like I said, he doesn't do too much. He follows the same pattern he's been doing in the last 2 arcs of stealing something, and having the cast use clues to try and track down the missing item. This game was no exception in that regard. He reveals himself as the Phantom Thief we all know and love about halfway through the game, but doesn't step up and actively participate in the greater conflict until close to the end. And even then, it's just to hang out with Vita and watch the chaos unfold. So that's all the main heroes and villains in the game. As I said earlier, the game has a very uniform structure, pretty fitting for a military academy. Something happens at the beginning of the chapter, Reed runs errands for the student council, Class 7 explores a new area in the abandoned schoolhouse, which by the way is an expanding dungeon that becomes relevant at the end of the game. The class is then given a practical exam the next day, they split into 2 groups and go on a field study that weekend, something fucked up happens during the field study, usually culminating in a big boss fight, and then the chapter ends. This is how every chapter, save for the finale, ends up going. Since I covered a lot of ground when talking about the characters specifically, I guess the game's overarching plot would be the Civil War and the stuff leading up to it. Like I said, the war was already mentioned back in Azure, so if you're playing in release order, you already knew there was going to be one. As a matter of fact, they even revealed that it's the Reformists, the commoner side, that wins, which I think was unnecessary. I don't think they needed to tell you that all the way back in Crossbell, and I think I would have preferred if they had just left that part a mystery, because now I'm going to be playing Cold Steel 2 already knowing that the noble faction is ultimately going to fail, and I would have preferred the added suspense, but it's just my opinion. But there were definitely little hints shown to the characters that imply that something was on the horizon. First of all, there was pretty much anything that the terrorists spent their screen time saying, since both the Noble faction and the Imperial Liberation Front hated the Chancellor and wanted him gone. They did cooperate with each other as much as they could without drawing suspicion. There were plenty of things like aggravating small businesses, arresting Machias for no reason to use as leverage against his father, sending iron and other metals to the black market market, and many other shady practices that the various provincial armies, which are led by noble families, intentionally either turned a blind eye to or actively participated in. This really came to a head after you clear the last floor of the schoolhouse and defeat the final boss, because I was sitting here thinking, well, I killed the final boss, so they're probably just going to give me a 30-minute cutscene to wrap things up, and then I'll be able to go to bed early tonight.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
I should have known damn well that couldn't have been further from the truth. This is Trails we're talking about here. Much like Sky FC, the final boss was kind of random, but it does reveal a deactivated mech that was chilling out down there. Remember that, because it'll be important in a little bit. During this time, the Academy's annual festival is going on, and during the after party, this is when the principal breaks the news that Crossbell pried its independence out of the Empire and Republic's less than thrilled hands, and Dieter's White Ion vaporized Guerrilla Fortress earlier that same day. All classes are cancelled the next day, and everyone's encouraged to listen in on Osborne's speech regarding what just happened and where they're going to go from there. So Osborne is giving his speech, and as he's yapping on about how he can't believe that Crossbell did what they did and how they need to respond, Milliam gets a call from Lecter. Apparently they figured out C's identity. Unfortunately, too little too late. Crow had slipped out earlier that morning claiming he wanted to go listen to the Chancellor's speech in person. Of course, the real reason he wanted to go was so he could shoot Osborne, which he does. Claire rushes to the rooftop to try and detain him, but it turns out Crow had his own mech, and that's not all.
Mech, 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 mech.
Turns out all the iron that the noble faction was stockpiling was used for the construction of numerous mechs, soldat units as they're called. And even though the Imperial Army had just gotten some new tanks specifically for the purpose of added security, they still got folded up like aluminum foil. Misty, who had been reporting on Osborne's speech over the radio right up until he got shot, revealed that she's bad, of course, and it also tips off the player that Ouroboros is backing the noble faction as well, which explains how they managed to get so many new toys so quickly. With this new added support, the noble faction manages to take the capital city of Heimdall with minimal effort. Meanwhile, Vulcan, Scarlet, and several terrorists piloting their own soldats head over to the academy to try and capture it and take the students there hostage. Sarah and all the other instructors gather together to take down Vulcan's group, but keep in mind, the terrorists were planning a pincer attack, so the instructors are not aware of Scarlet and a fellow companion coming in from the other side. Sharon decides to step forward and help the instructors, and I guess now is as good of a time as any to briefly talk about her. I really wasn't sure whether I should have dropped her in Legend of Heroes or Lore of Villains, so I'm talking about her now. She's the personal maid for the Reinford family, as I said before, and also helped to raise Elisa when her parents were too busy. Early on in the game, she moves into Class 7's dorm to help with chores, cooking, and other types of housekeeping, though I wouldn't be shocked if her real reason for doing this was related to the Civil War and she was probably doing recon for the Reinford family, and by extension the Reformist faction. And the only reason I say this is because she's also Ouroboros' Enforcer number 9, and reveals her second occupation, bondage. At first I was pretty confused because I was like, if she's an enforcer, shouldn't she be helping the noble faction? But she reveals that she's currently on leave from that position, so her priority is helping the Reinford family, which again, places everyone's goals in alignment. I still think she's not going to stay that way though. Working for Ouroboros creates too much of a conflict of interest, and I wouldn't be surprised if she switches sides again. Meanwhile, Class 7 goes in the other direction to take care of Scarlet's group. She almost beats them until Reen calls up the mech from the old schoolhouse, the Divine Knight Valimar, and to my great surprise, the mech battles are actually playable. Divine Knight battles are very similar to normal ones, the only big difference being that linking is done automatically between the pilot and the mech. Matter of fact, the Divine Knight's rush attack looks more like an S-craft than a rush, but yeah. Reen, piloting Valimar, easily overpowers Scarlet's mech, but just when it seems all might be well, Crow shows up with his Divine Knight, Ordine. And this is the actual, no bullshit, no more surprises, final boss of the game. Thank you, Falcom, yet again for keeping me up late enough to see the sunlight start poking through my windows. Although I would say even though the duel with Ordine is sequentially the final boss, I still think that last battle in the old schoolhouse was the final boss. You get what I'm saying? Like, this stuff right here is more of an epilogue to bridge the gap between this game and the next one, and while the Decisive Collision was a good song, Enormous Inner Strength, probably the best final boss theme I've heard in the series so far, definitely added that sense of finality to the whole situation. Anyway, Reen seems to have beaten Crow, but Crow turns on some feature that they don't really go into any detail on here, but whatever it is, it gives him the boost needed to overpower Reen. Celine, who was in the mech with Reen, commands Valimar to fly off to goddess knows where, much to Reen's horror, leaving the remainder of Class 7 there to deal with Crow. And considering how much trouble it took them to take out a normal green Soldot, and the fact they couldn't even scratch Scarlet's command unit, let alone Crow's Divine Knight, yeah, things aren't looking too good for them. And the story ends there. Actually, now that I've typed it out, this one seems even more backloaded than Sky FC, because at least when Sky FC dropped its plot twist on you, there was only like 10 minutes left. They most certainly didn't drop a string of extra bosses on you after a 2-hour cutscene. Don't get me wrong, I loved the shit out of this game, but man, you killed that final boss and these guys really said, okay, movie night. But surprisingly, it's still shorter than Azure's final chapter. And speaking of Azure's final chapter, that's where we currently are in the timeline. As I said before, Cold Steel 1 covered Late Zero and the majority of Azure. Cold Steel 2 runs concurrently with Azure's final chapter. So all goes well, expect coverage on that pretty soon, especially since Cold Steel 1 ended on a cliffhanger. But for now, that will be the end of this video, so you guys know the drill. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, sub to the channel if you haven't already. A special thanks to all channel members for your continued support, it's much appreciated, and I will see you all again very soon.